Hello, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are internationally, and welcome to Oban, Scotland for the inaugural aquaNOW audience. An initial 6 aquaNOW audiences, which were announced by OOSKAnews earlier this year, will be produced over the next 8 months, physically hosted in the beautiful and topical country of Scotland in a number of venues. Scotland, which has recently declared itself the hydro nation because of its wealth of more than one liquid resource and its association with excellent water quality. While being hosted in Scotland, these web-streamed events will be visible live and in an archived format to an international audience for a period of 2 years post the event, and our next event after today is on the 11th of November, so perhaps folks can put that in their diaries now. aquaNOW audiences are about water. Water themes addressed by these gatherings include and will feature disparate perspectives on competing demands on water resources. Demands such as climate change, development aid, business risk and opportunity, and perspectives different by design. There are a number of sectors within the water sector, families within the water family, from technology to policy, governance, legal perspectives, business perspectives, whether those are on the opportunity side, water technology, or on the business risk side, which is corporates are becoming much more aware of. Our events will also showcase exemplars in Scottish water technology in thanks to our hosts and sponsors who are the Scottish Government, Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise. Our occasions are very intentionally not designed to be academic seminars. We are aiming for a panel and video link format which brings together people from these disparate constituencies to speak in a language about water that each other understand and that broader society and the political economy can understand, with a view to raising the profile of water on the global agenda. In the second half of this inaugural aquaNOW audience, we will have a soft theme, which is where the river meets the sea. We are being hosted on this first occasion by the Scottish Association for Marine Science, and it is in recognition of their kindness in having us physically here today that we will be looking at some marine-related freshwater issues. But firstly, I'm going to let our panelists here today introduce themselves, starting with the representative of our host here in Oban on the west coast of Scotland at the Scottish Association for Marine Science, to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about our venue here and where SAMS has come from. We have Dr. Paul Tett.
Thank you, David. Well, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Scottish Association for Marine Science, and I would like to welcome you here to the Scottish Marine Institute. Where are we? We're on the northwest coast of Scotland, near the port town of Oban, about 100 miles by road from Glasgow. And this institute is a collection of new purpose-built laboratories and facilities on the shore of a little bay. Here it's afternoon. It's a fine early autumn afternoon on the west coast of Scotland, and the bay's filled with yachts. Next door to us is the ruined castle of Dunstafnage, which at one time commanded the sea roads of the Firth of Lorne, the great gash in the west coast of Scotland. And in this day when we get about our roads and aircraft, it's easy to forget that for most of human history people have travelled by boat. We were on the Firth of Lorne was the marine motorway until about 100 years ago. On the northern horizon, you can see a fringe of mountains, and one of them is Scotland's highest, Ben Nevis. So that tells you where we're sited. We're holding this occasion in the Sheena Marshall building, which is a newly built teaching building, and it's named after a pioneering woman scientist and my predecessor in this association. Sheena joined what was called the Scottish Marine Biological Association in 1921, when it was a much smaller organisation than now. It had been founded in 1884, so 130 years ago, by Sir John Murray, and it moved to the present site near Oban in 1969. The Scottish Association for Marine Science has got four aspects. It's a learned society with members. It's a research organisation with 160 staff, based here in the Scottish Marine Institute. It has a consultancy partner company. And finally, it's a teaching institution that's part of the University of the Highlands and Islands and the United Nations University. And the institute, the Scottish Marine Institute, is our physical base here on the west coast of Scotland, though currently there are members of SAMS working on ships probably all over the world. And what SAMS aims to do is first carry out cutting-edge research into marine systems science, especially at middle and high latitudes in waters around Scotland and around the Arctic. It aims to apply this fundamental knowledge to areas of topical relevance, particularly marine renewables, energy generation, aquaculture, and marine mining and the marine disposal of mine wastes. And finally, it aims to provide evidence about marine governance to national and international policymakers. So that's a bit about the association. Now I should say a bit more about myself. So my name is Paul Tett. I'm a reader in coastal systems at the Scottish Association for Marine Science. I'm a biological oceanographer who's grown interested in how coastal societies can sustain themselves beyond the 21st century. This is a critical time, I think, in the history of humanity on the Earth. And I'm the joint author of a book called Sustaining Coastal Zone Systems, published in 2011 by Dunedin Academic Press in Edinburgh, which is an attempt to set out what the problem is and how we might solve it. So I thought I'd end with an anecdote to illustrate my interest in some of the things I'm going to say this afternoon. Although much of my working life has been spent working with marine systems, I have studied freshwater systems, and in 1974 I was at the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's University in Charlottesville, and I was working on the Meacham's River in the Blue Ridge Mountains as part of a project aimed at estimating the contribution of rivers to the flow of oxygen, or to the production and the consumption of oxygen, and the effect on this production and consumption of plant nutrients from wastewater and from agriculture. And we wanted to estimate river flow. So instead of sticking a current meter into the river, I thought I'd do something much more elegant and cheaper, which was buy a couple of pounds of oranges and throw them into the water. And oranges are roughly the same density as water, so they flow along with the water. You can see them easily, and so they're a very good tracker of water. So I threw these oranges into the top of a bend in the Meacham's River, started my stopwatch, and scurried across to the lower part of the bend so that I could time them as they went by. Yeah. Well, the conclusion of this story is I never saw those oranges again. They disappeared somewhere on the way, and in essence I'm still looking for them 40 years later. So what I mean by this parable is to suggest that everything that happens in the world is partly determined by law, and in this case that would have been the laws governing river flow, and partly determined by chance. So probably my oranges got snagged on a branch somewhere. Scientists aim to discover these laws and use them to make predictions, like the consequences of global warming, which I'm sure we're going to touch on this afternoon. But both our studies and our predictions are subject to the uncertainties introduced by chance. So you should bear this in mind when you're thinking about anything I might say later. The scientific laws of causal relationships say what on average must happen, but what actually happens in particular instances may well be modified by circumstances. So, thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And to my right, your left, on the panel, Renee Martin-Nagel. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I don't think I'll be quite as eloquent as Paul was, but my name is Renee Martin-Nagel, as David said, and my path to water passed through aviation for 25 years, and for 21 of those years I was the chief lawyer for Airbus in North America. But in 2007, when my oldest grandchild was born, I had a crisis of conscience and decided to dedicate the rest of my life to environmental causes. I went back to law school at night while working my full-time day job and got a master's of law and LLM in environmental law. And you have to write a thesis since that's a master's. So I started thinking about what I cared about, and that was preventing and resolving conflicts. And it was clear to me that global conflicts would arise over sharing water resources. So I did my thesis on fossil aquifers and how to share fossil aquifers, and that led me into water. So I left my job in January of 2011 and immediately joined the Environmental Law Institute as a visiting scholar. The Environmental Law Institute is a well-regarded think tank in Washington, D.C. that is nonpartisan. It doesn't lobby. It doesn't advocate. It just does quality research. And it covers a lot of territories, including water, which is what led me to joining them in the first place. So since then, I have been mostly a scholar for the last 3 years, researching, writing, doing public speaking on environmental issues, both in aviation and in water. And in March, I'll be moving to lovely Scotland to enroll at the University of Strathclyde as a PhD candidate in transboundary aquifer governance. And I think I will pass it from there to the next person.
Thank you, Renee. Very briefly, I'm David Duncan. I'm the CEO and founder of OOSKAnews. And those of you who are watching remotely have tuned in to this transmission at OOSKAnews.com. We are the world's leading publisher of water-related news and intelligence with offices in the United States and also in Scotland. Renee's travelled furthest to be with us today. Our next panellist is somewhat closer to home here in Oban. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please? It's Kevin Jeffrey.
Thanks. Well, there's my name, Kevin Jeffrey. I'm Managing Director of a company called Wastewater Wizard. And we build vermifiltration systems, but in simple terms, we just use worms to treat wastewater. Looking at my background, where I fit in, I like to think I'm a wee bit of a reformed chemist. I moved out of the labs about 20 years ago and I've been in the water industry ever since. And I've worked from working with the operations, doing troubleshooting, then into design development, implementation, the civils, construction, then commissioning, and ultimately the client handover. But one thing that got me very early on in my career is in wastewater treatment. What the basic thing that we do is we build happy homes for bugs. Bugs do the wastewater treatment, that's in simple terms. And it's never changed for about the past 100 years. And I always wondered, could we do it better looking at a different type of organism? So that got my mind set off on a certain track of thought. And it was around this time I was lucky enough, I was put on a small team made up of some of the Water UK PLCs. And at that time we were looking at worms treating sewage sludge. That's when my light bulb moment came. I'd found my organism, but then what could I do with that organism? And I worked on it. We could actually use it to treat actual wastewater. And I've been developing these wizard systems since, and I launched the company a few years ago. But where do I fit into the overall scheme of things? I'm a wastewater treatment guy. I do fit at the back end of everything, and where I actually sit in between everything, you've got the legislation which clearly details what must be achieved by who and by what time and that, and then you've got the regulators enforcing that. In between that, you've got Joe Public, you've got industry, you've got businesses. They're producing widgets, they're producing wastewater. They've got to fit into that. I provide some of the solutions to deliver their outcomes, and be it environmentally or whatever, and let them get on building widgets for ever more. That's basically me. That's
Great,
where I fit in.
thank you very much, Kevin. And to Kevin's left, if we can hear something about you, please, Juan Carlos Sanchez.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, everyone here in the room, and everyone back home watching this. My name is Juan Carlos Sanchez. I'm a Costa Rican lawyer. Costa Rica, you might recognize not only for being a great soccer nation, but also by being a country that shares waters to both of its boundaries. To our west and to our east, we have the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, but to the north and to the south of the countries, we share the rivers with our neighbors, with Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and with Panama. And this, you will see that this sharing waters and sharing rivers is pretty much one of the areas of interest on my research. I started my career working as a corporate lawyer, but soon enough I was moving into environmental issues, which took me to Germany, to Freiburg University, to study environmental governance. There I was jumping into the Environmental Law Center of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, a quasi-intergovernmental organization composed of member states and non-member states, looking mostly at conservation of biodiversity issues. And water is one of their main key ecosystems in which they actually work. This allowed me to develop further my interest in transboundary water governance, and has allowed me the opportunity to work in Latin America, both in South America and Central America, and also in the Mekong region. From there, I had the opportunity to collaborate with brilliant lawyers, and that brought me to the University of Dundee, to the Center for Water, Law, Policy and Science of the University of Dundee, where I'm actually doing my PhD at the moment. And the topic of my research has to do with understanding whether water treaties actually make a difference on ecosystem management and ecosystem protection. So I'm trying to understand if our preferred governance tool in transboundary ecosystems, which are water treaties, actually have a positive impact or not in development of water treaties. I'm a hydronation scholar, which some of you might know that it's the program of Scotland for implementing the hydronation strategy, which pretty much seeks to secure Scotland's water resources internally, but externally it aims to pose Scotland as one of the world water leaders or a world water champion in several issues, including water governance, which it might be a good opportunity just to make a small advertisement and also a date for the diaries of the viewers, to remind that we will have the International Water Resources Association Congress on the 25th to 29th of May of next year. So just a little note on that. And just to wrap up, so where do I see myself in this big picture, and how do I fit in with the colleagues that we are sharing the panel here? I think my predecessor was very eloquent in mentioning the role of law in all of this, right? Basically, law as the framework which sets up the rules of the game, and the framework that has a lot of things to offer by means of bringing equity and justice into complex relationships, considering also nature as one of the players and stakeholders to be taken into account, but also a system that can be pretty much more improved. So I'm a I'm trying to wave the flag for legal systems. I believe that they are very important in terms of bringing a leveling playing field for improving not only living standards of peoples and populations, but also of nature. So I leave it to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Let me add, it would be remiss of me not to add briefly, you mentioned the International Water Resources Association and its 15th Congress, which will meet in Edinburgh in May 2015. I know that abstracts can still be submitted for that event. The deadline for submission is the 31st of October. And they can be submitted by going to worldwatercongress.com.
Yeah.
But not until after this, this web-streamed occasion. Next, Richard. Richard Allen, please tell us about you.
Thank you, David. So I'm Richard Allen. I'm a research fellow at the James Hutton Institute, and it's a real privilege for me to work at the Institute. The main thrust of the research is really about sustainability and the environment, and it supports agriculture, aquaculture, coastal catchment management. There's a whole range of really good stuff within the Institute. But formerly I was the chief scientist at Scottish Water, so I had responsibility for checking the water supply across Scotland and making sure it was clean and fit to drink, and ensuring public health was protected. And it was a very interesting and engaging job, as you can imagine. And from there I moved to become the managing director of Scottish Water Horizons, which delivered a series of renewable energy projects for Scottish Water using redundant assets. I also covered a range of other services as well, but I won't go into that. From there I set up my own business, and I've done a range of consultancy jobs in between, but I'm really happy now to be working within the James Hutton Institute. The main theme of my research is really focused on sustainable, resource-efficient water supplies, everything from relatively small-scale rural supplies, whether they're public or private supplies, but going through to medium and even into larger scale systems. And I'm particularly interested in new and novel sustainable treatment works and treatment technologies.
Thank you, Richard. And then finally, someone who our viewers can't see directly at these tables, but joining us by video link from Oregon in the United States, and up earlier than the rest of us. Thank you very much. It's Dr. John Matthews. John, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Great, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to participate. I really appreciate it. My name's John Matthews, and I coordinate a group, the secretary of a group called the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, AGWA. My own kind of personal journey is that I was trained as an aquatic ecologist, and I was unusual in my PhD program in that I had no desire to become an academic, and when I graduated, my first position was with WWF, the environmental organization, and I was coordinating their global freshwater climate adaptation program. And a lot of that was a very direct kind of field program, very localized support. I was working a great deal in places like China, India, Brazil. And I became very aware through that process that many of the local issues around water management that was sustainable, that was resilient and flexible at a local level were actually very limited in the options that they had open to them. That they were really issues that were in many cases the decisions had been made. They were structurally determined by other kinds of forces, and I felt like I needed to kind of move up the food chain of governance. And starting about 4 years ago, just over 4 years ago, with a colleague from the World Bank, an economist, we founded AGWA, And I think he'd come to a very similar place through a very different kind of evolution and journey in terms of thinking about climate change, climate adaptation as a systemic issue. And we organized AGWA to really focus on the kind of operational problems. There's so much rapid evolution in how we think about what sustainable water management should look like over the timescales that it's relevant for, the implications for infrastructure, for economics and finance, for regulatory perspectives, the legal and governance roles. These are all very challenging. Plus, the science itself is actually relatively weak in terms of being able to predict and project. So we became very interested in how we could make AGWA be an organization that could span a wide variety of organizations, a wide variety of types of organizations, and also cut across a lot of institutional and disciplinary boundaries. So in many ways, I think it fits in very well with some of the goals of this meeting. So we're a very practical group working on often a very challenging problem, and I'm excited about engaging in this dialogue with this esteemed group of panelists. Thank you.
Very much, John. Before we move further, a couple of housekeeping notes. We will do a further 30 minutes until 3 p.m. local time here in Scotland with panelists discussing a couple of questions that we have designed to elicit disparate perspectives from different views within the world of water. We here in Oban will then be taking a 30-minute break before resuming at 3:30 for the second part of this first aquaNOW audience. I'd like to take a quick opportunity to advise our international viewers that questions can be submitted online as well as from our audience here in the room. If you're in the room, put up your hand. If you are not, then please email info, I-N-F-O, at OOSKAnews.com, and we'll be monitoring that address, and pleased to accept questions, and I'll pass them on to our panel for discussion. In our next phase, we would like each of the panelists, and I think I'll just do this in the same order, to ask or consider a broad question and bring their expertise and perspective to the notion, to the question, what is it that keeps you awake at night about world water challenges? What is the biggest water-related problem our planet faces? What should we be most worried about? And I'll ask Paul Tett to go first, please.
Okay, well, so what keeps me awake at night with water is the noise of the rain on my roof. But entering into the spirit of the question, what are the problems that face the world? I wouldn't like to venture an opinion on what is the biggest problem, but I will venture an opinion. And the issue that I most worry about is the consequence of rising sea level, which is itself a consequence of global climate warming. The effect of rising sea level, well, its interaction with increasing rainfall and river flows. So the predictions for sea level rise do not seem very great at first instance. They're somewhere between 30 centimetres and 90 centimetres by the end of the century. That's 1 foot to 3 foot if you work in imperial units, or about maximum this high if you work in some other units. That doesn't sound very much, less than a metre. But the problem is that rise in basic sea level can be augmented by high tides and by what are called storm surges. And storm surges come about when low atmospheric pressure due to a depression causes sea level to rise higher than expected. So the combination of a storm surge, a high spring tide, and rising sea level might add 3 or 4 metres onto normal sea level. And the point is, quite a lot of the world is built within 3 or 4 metres of the normal high water mark. One could walk around the coast here near Oban and see houses that have been built within a metre of high water mark. But those are marine issues. There's an additional complication. Many of the world's big cities are built on estuaries. London is a prime example. And the issue there is what happens when a rising tide and increased sea level and a storm surge meets a flood coming down the river from sustained heavy rainfall. The London barrier is designed to protect London against high tides. It's also designed to control floods. But sometime in this century, it's going to run into problems when it encounters a flood and a high tide at the same. So an item of concern to me is that sometime in this century, London, much of central London, is going to be flooded unless further steps are taken to deal with this. And this is an issue for many other cities around the world as well. And I think that's where I'll stop. I think there are solutions for this, but that's my concern.
Thank you, Paul. And during this, answering of big questions phase, other panelists, please chip in with any thoughts or observations on each other's contributions. Renee, what keeps you awake at night?
Well, because I focus mostly on aquifers, I'm aware that aquifers represent probably 97 to 98% of the available fresh water on the planet. So all of the rivers and the lakes and everything that you see out there, that's only 2 to 3% of the available fresh water. We don't count the poles, we don't count the glaciers, even though they're melting. So let's say 97%. So 97% of the water is underground, and it's being pumped at an unsustainable rate, and often an invisible rate, because it's below the surface, and so you don't see that the water levels are going down, 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 down. And my thesis was on fossil aquifers, which are aquifers where the water has been sealed in place for thousands or millions of years. And so they don't recharge by definition. But there are many rechargeable aquifers that serve as part of an ecosystem. And so the rain comes down and it soaks into the ground, and then it comes out somewhere, sometimes in a river or sometimes in a waterfall, and it serves an ecosystem. And so for our needs, for our human needs, we are pumping an unsustainable amount of water out of the aquifers. And so the water is coming out of the aquifers and it's entering into the atmosphere. With global warming, there's more evaporation, and the air is capable of holding more water, which means that the water comes down in greater and greater torrents, and that can lead to some sea level rise because there's more water coming out of the aquifers and going into the land and into the sea. But what keeps me awake at night is a couple of issues. One, we're using so much water and depleting the aquifers, and we're using a lot for agriculture to feed the growing population. We're at 7 billion now. It's estimated we'll be at 8 billion in 2030, 9 to 10.5 billion in 2050. And will there be enough water for the crops that will be needed to feed all those people? And if humans take all of that water for ourselves, to feed ourselves, then what's left for the ecosystems? What's left for the other species with which we share this planet? And how does that affect biodiversity? Because we exist in a web of biodiversity. And a report just came out last week where 40 to 50% of the species have been disappearing, like in the last 40 years. And what will that mean in another 40 years? Are we going to have it again? Is there a half-life for biodiversity now? All land-based creatures need fresh water. Without fresh water, they can't survive, we can't survive. And so I worry that humans are going to take all the water for ourselves because we can, without paying attention to the needs of other species. So that's what keeps me awake at night.
Thank you. Renee, other species. Richard, you're the worm guy, but broadly about water issues, what keeps you awake at night?
Well, fun enough, I'm coming from a technology viewpoint. Everybody hears a lot, reads the papers, sees in telly there's a lot of issues facing man, and we've just heard quite eloquently on some of the issues facing there. and a lot of the times the public gets switched off, but it's trying to gauge the public to get them involved in this, because we are part of the solution. We can tell them what the problems are, but we've also got to open it up to say, well, here's how we're going to work on the solutions, but we need the engagement of all parties to do that. And behind that, if they're getting switched off, a lot of them, I've got my daughter, she's now going through a secondary school. It's the education to deliver these people of the future, to deliver new technologies, the thinking there. If they're getting scared of what's happening now and getting switched off, because we might be, when we go into our wee cliques, we do talk in scientific terminology that Joe public doesn't normally understand. And if we don't get it down to a level where we can get their engagement in it at an early stage, they are already getting turned off through the education system. I'm not going into that. For me, Dad talks a load of crap. That's what I do, that's my business. But we need to engage the youngsters coming through the systems, through the academics, through universities and colleges to deliver these. They've got the understanding to help deliver our problems. We'll solve some of them just now, but a lot, 20, 30 years when we're not here, we need the youngsters involved so they can be the people that's taking up ownership of these problems right now.
Great answer. Juan Carlos, what keeps you awake at night?
Well, I think what keeps me awake at night is the lack of regulation of shared rivers around the world, and it's not an issue that it's only important for a particular region or for a particular set of countries, but it's an issue that that if you see the world map and how shared rivers are spread out around the globe, you would notice very, very quickly that it's an important matter for basically the whole world. We have 276 transboundary rivers, some of them quite emblematic, like for instance the Mekong in Southeast Asia, or the Rhine River in Europe, or the Amazons River, or the Nile, just to mention some of the quite emblematic ones. And of those 276 rivers, only 40% of them have some type of cooperative mechanism, some type of legal arrangement that sets out the rules of the game for the different countries to use the waters in an equitable way. What does that mean? That there's 60% of the rivers of the world, of the shared waters of the world, that have no mechanism to deal with how extract rates are going to be dealt with, how unilateral actions are going to be dealt with, how different development projects are going to be dealt with. And how does this turn into a real world scenario? It's the typical, let's say, a dam scheme, for instance, where country A wants to build a dam. There's no legal framework to regulate the flows towards country B, and then country B suffers the impacts of those actions. So this type of lack of regulation actually keeps me a little bit troubled, but it's not because I only advocate for regulation per se. I think an important part of regulation is the establishment of joint collaborative platforms, which is a typical mechanism found in treaties for dealing with relationship between country A and country B. And the advantage of having this type of platforms is that you can deal with other problems, like the one that we were seeing before, rising sea levels, or John Matthews also mentioned climate change during his presentation. These are the type of problems that can be dealt with in joint institutions. So the institutional element for me, and the lack of institutions for shared rivers, is a particularly problematic issue.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Richard Allen.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Well, I think really what keeps me awake at night is very similar to some of the other speakers already. I mean, what concerns me is just the limited resources that we have internationally, particularly around fresh water. But if we think about fresh water in the context of food, water and energy and the interrelationship with these, then it becomes quite critical. We need to find better ways of managing the interplay between these three elements as consumer demands grow and people require more energy and require more fresh water to produce food. and foodstuffs are being moved into things like biofuels. So these are all very interconnected, and there are, as I say, a limited amount of resources there. And then you couple that with things like rising sea levels and over abstraction of aquifers and so on, and it really isn't sustainable. So I think as well as that, if you think about quite a lot of areas, there's a lot of populations still don't have access to fresh water. So there's close to about 1 billion people worldwide don't have access to safe drinking water, and about 2.5 billion that don't have access to safe sanitation, and that has to be addressed at the same time. And again, in a lot of these circumstances, it's not high-tech solutions. It's really low-tech, low-maintenance solutions. Looking at local decentralised systems as well as centralised systems, and only through really careful planning of the resources and looking at the interplay will they be able to actually resolve the issues. So that's
great. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Finally, on this question, and then I'd like to encourage a little bit of discussion about some of the answers. But before that, John Matthews, please, what keeps you awake at night?
Well, what kept me awake this night was having to get up so early for this particular. But more generally speaking, I think one of the issues that really concerns me is that I feel like in most cases we make water management decisions that are focused on, say, a 2 or 5 year framework, maybe a 10-year framework, when we're really making 100-year decisions or 500-year decisions, in some cases even 1,000-year decisions. And that there's a really big gap in how we conceive of sustainability. I read a lot of history as an ecologist. I think about very long periods of time relative to the way that humans experience time. And I don't really hear people talking about sustainability over 200, 300, 400 years. And I actually think that's probably the time scale that we should be articulating. And what does this mean in kind of practical terms? My favorite example for the past year or so has been the Hoover Dam. People are very aware of the drought globally, I think, that's been occurring in California, and the wildfires and the scarcity issues. But the Hoover Dam, which is in Nevada, and the Nevada-Arizona border, quite close to California, is arguably experiencing something like a 20 or 30 year, very slow drought process that probably has a climate change component. The dam itself is about 80 years old, 90 years old, and it, as Juan Carlos was talking about in terms of governance agreements, even when there is a governance agreement in a shared water basin, it may be very inflexible. It may not be able to address new kinds of challenges and problems. And the Hoover Dam is in a sense, the concrete expression of bad governance arrangements. It crystallizes in concrete and rebar these bad arrangements, and the climate has diverged from it in kind of short-term realities. Over the last few years, that the hydropower generation has dropped about 25% from the Hoover Dam. It's expected to drop another 25% by next May. And if you step back a little bit farther from maybe a more holistic view of a development, the many cities that contain tens of millions of people across this region, the industries that have grown up in agriculture, in gambling for Las Vegas, and other kinds of sectors, depend on the water. That region of North America is very arid, and it effectively floats on the direct and indirect fruit of that dam. And that water is probably going back to the water that's available in that basin is probably going back to levels that we're seeing maybe 1,000 or 1,500 years ago. What happens to the 40 or 50 million people that are there? And I would argue that the U.S. is a rich country, will be able to deal with it. It will be very painful, expensive, and conflict-ridden. But the kinds of investments that the Hoover Dam reflects are that we made 80 or 90 years ago are the kinds of investments that we're making every day in East Africa, in South Asia, in East Asia, in South America. And we're making those investments at a very accelerated rate. So that gap between kind of short-term thinking about sustainability is something we measure at less than a decade, maybe a decade or two, but we're creating these structures that are our interface. They are our hands on water resources that they last many decades, sometimes many centuries. And then they lock us into certain, often very negative and inflexible decision pathways.
Thank you very much. John, let me pick up on something that occurred to me as you spoke. You and Juan Carlos talked about dams in your very good answers, and there does seem to be a something of a consensus among the different water families that dams are a bad thing. Two follow-ups to that. One, I'd be quite interested to hear Richard Allen talk a little bit about micro hydropower generation and the Scottish experience, which may offer a different perspective on dams are bad. But also, John, Juan Carlos, and I were all in Stockholm 3 weeks ago for World Water Week, the 24th World Water Week. It's a very good occasion which has a different theme each year and gathers together not the technology people, perhaps that's a criticism, but the NGOs, the government agencies, the international institutions to talk about matters of concern around water, and this year's theme was the water energy nexus. I attended a number of presentations where there was discussion about water stresses having knock-on effects for almost all forms of power generation. I don't recall dams and hydroelectricity being discussed at all, and I wonder, maybe I missed those sessions, or maybe that was a point that was missed, because surely that is certainly the most visible area of intersection between water management and power generation. Did you see much about hydroelectricity in Stockholm this year, John?
I did. I was specifically looking for that theme, and I think that there's a very broad debate that's occurring. I'm not sure that it's proven to be, at least in my thinking, a very effective debate about what sustainable hydropower can and should be. Your kind of larger question too is very relevant. Are dams, especially hydropower dams, which are driving a lot of the infrastructure development in the developing world, are they necessarily a bad thing? Right? I'm speaking to you in the Columbia River Basin, one of the most highly exploited river basins in terms of hydropower in the world. I'm lit by hydropower, literally, at this moment. And the U.S. has something like 10% of the world's dams, about 80,000. It's very easy for me in this country to say that other countries, especially in the developing world, shouldn't have dams, and they shouldn't exploit particularly their hydropower resources. I think that sustainable hydropower is currently not well defined, but it is an achievable goal, and it is something that we can make more pragmatic and operational. We can be more more flexible in how we think about infrastructure and operations itself, and we can ELI, for instance, has done a great job in promoting environmental flows programs that ensure that the ecosystem is a strong stakeholder. IUCN as well, and that it's viewed as a kind of concurrent stakeholder. And I think that's a really key element in how we think about what sustainable energy more generally should be thought of, particularly in the developing world.
Juan Carlos.
Sorry, if I may, just to complement what John said, that's in terms of national rivers. If you say, I think that was the impression that I was getting from John's intervention. Excuse me if I got it wrong, but it's this idea that within a country you have to respect different environmental standards, including environmental flows. You have to respect social standards, including in the case of indigenous peoples, etc., etc. But just to state my position so that it's not misunderstood, it's not that I'm against dams per se. What I'm against is unilateral action in transboundary rivers. I don't agree of projects being taken without letting your neighbor know what's going to happen and just letting the country downstream feel the impacts of your decisions, which, as was said before, they are decisions that have very deep impacts on the whole ecosystem. So I think dams can have and will have definitely an important role to play, but to establish negotiation mechanisms between the countries for sharing benefits of big enterprises like dams are maybe another of the alternatives that we have to look for.
Thank you. Richard, you spoke briefly in your self-introduction about part of the narrative of water in Scotland being good governance in the sense of maximising land resources that hold water. And some of that, Scotland doesn't have huge big dams, and it barely has a transboundary river. But perhaps you could speak to the Scottish story.
Yeah, sure. So Scotland actually holds roughly 90% of all the freshwater stocks in the UK, and it's about a third of the land mass, and it has 5 million of a population compared to 65-70 million for the rest of the UK. So we do hold substantial stocks of fresh water. A large part of that's in Loch Ness, actually, but never mind that. We are a water-rich nation, and that kind of forms the foundation of the Hydronation initiative that the Scottish Government are running at the moment. In terms of hydro potential, clearly there is a lot of hydro potential out there, and I'm certainly not going to state the case for or against dams. There are a few dams in Scotland, but not to the same scale that you get in America, South America, China and other places. What we do have experience of, particularly in Scottish Water, is delivering relatively localised small-scale hydro schemes. So the turbines can be perhaps 100 kilowatts or so, and they really make best use of the assets that are already in the ground, and use the flows through pipes and so on. But the second area of hydro power generation, which I think is quite interesting, is actually using the pressure within the distribution systems. So some of the projects that Scottish Water are looking at look to replace pressure reduction valves. So within a water distribution system, you control the pressure. So during peak demand, when people are making cups of tea in the morning and having showers and so on, the valves open to allow water through. And then the rest of the day, where there's less demand, the valves shut and therefore kind of hold the pressure back. But what Scottish Water have started to do is effectively put in hydropower generators where the pressure reduction valves are. So instead of the energy dissipating into the environment, they actually capture that through a mini turbine and then put that back into the grid. So that's actually making best use of the water flows as it goes to the customer's taps. So those are all very, very good mechanisms for actually creating sustainable hydropower systems. But I think John's absolutely right to say that large hydro schemes can be sustainable, but you need to think about the asset strategy and the long-term planning of these things, and you certainly need to think about the ecosystems and the impact. And Juan Carlos is right. I've been to a number of conferences now where they're talking about dam projects upstream and perhaps transboundary issues as well. And these are critical, and I would fully support the comments that there needs to be between country agreements to actually share the benefits of these types of schemes and understand the impact downstream of the systems.
Thank you. Before we break for coffee, I'd like to relay a question that has come from Elizabeth Howard in Washington, D.C. Perhaps one that you could talk to first, Renee. With regard to transboundary waters, water is frequently described as both a source of conflict and a platform for cooperation. What do you see as more prevalent, likely, water wars or water as a vehicle for peace? And perhaps you could speak to that from the aquifers standpoint, and Juan Carlos talk about shared rivers. Can water? It's not all bad things like the Mosul Dam or the Renaissance Dam being causes of conflict. Can water also be a vehicle towards peace?
I'd like to be an optimist about human nature, and so I'd like to believe that it can be a vehicle towards peace. And with respect to aquifers, what we see most often is, well, first of all, it's hard to tell when an aquifer is being depleted. And so, you put your straw in the aquifer and the liquid is coming out, and it's hard to know how quickly it's being depleted unless you have good measuring sources. But what we've seen with respect to aquifers around the world is that where they are shared, the nations understand that it is a resource that must be protected. And so with respect to the larger aquifers, we're seeing nations reach agreements at least about sharing information and sometimes about sharing. There's one in place now with respect to the Nubian sandstone aquifer, which is in North Africa, and there's also one in place with the Guarani aquifer in South America. And so these nations have come together and said, we need to protect this resource for all of our sakes, and let's figure out how to do that. So I would side on cooperation rather than war.
Optimism from Renee. What do you think, Juan Carlos?
No, I have also to be optimist. I wanted to play devil's advocate, but no, I will go for the optimist answer. Also because there's little evidence of the opposite. There's little evidence of conflict in terms of wars related to water. If you go through the history textbooks, you will see that you can count with one hand the type of wars that have been exclusively about water. That doesn't mean that there's a lot of potential for conflict. There's definitely a lot of potential for conflict. So that's a call once again for having regulatory schemes between countries, because coordination is not something that happens out of the blue. Coordination, it's something that requires a established platform for the things that Alan was talking about, for instance, energy and food security, just to mention a couple of them. Put also pressures related to climate change, for instance. Those are type of things that will put more and more pressure on the shared resources, and that could, if you don't have coordination mechanisms and cooperation mechanisms in place, could put more stressors into conflictive scenarios. Therefore, yes, there's a lot of potential for conflict, but that's a call for establishing clear rules of the game for dealing with those conflicts, whatever they might be, because at this time of the game, we really cannot foresee all the problems that will develop in the future. Therefore, you have to have flexible cooperative mechanisms in place.
Well, Ted,
Can I ask a question
please.
before we finish? Just wondering what Renee and Carlos and maybe other people on the panel think about the European Water Framework Directive. Does it succeed in creating a framework for transboundary collaboration over both water volume and water quality issues?
Well, it affects surface water more, I think, so I don't know if you want to take that.
Definitely, I think the European model serves as a good example for what we call a multi-level governance, right? Because if you take into consideration the different types of rules that affect shared water resources in Europe, let's take for example, the Danube. You would see that it has a global convention that affects the decisions that are being taken. Then you have a regional instrument like the Water Framework Directive. Then you have a specific convention, the Danube River Agreement, and then you have the national legislation. And all of those things have to be coordinated in order for having better water management in place. And that's a complicated thing. It has the risk of overregulation, but so far it has proven quite well for dealing with pollution, for instance, within the Danube. So you have a good example of how things can actually work out. I'm not saying that we should export the example one-to-one, but it gives you hints of things that can be well done and can be taken as examples of good lessons into different parts of the world.
And building on what you just said, the European Water Framework Directive serves as a good example of water cooperation. And I really believe as there are more and more of us humans and more demands on water, we're going to have to reach cooperative mechanisms for sharing that water. And so we're seeing through time and recent time over just the last couple of decades where there are these agreements that serve as models for other agreements. And so I think that the Water Framework Directive serves as a good model for other regions that are trying to find a way to share water.
But Kevin, wouldn't you argue that that's all very well, but there needs to be political will that is driven by popular understanding, and that people don't understand somewhat complex water issues because of deficiencies in education, deficiencies in media reporting about water issues?
Where we are just now, we've got the academics doing the research, feeding hopefully the politicians. They're taking it on board and legislating accordingly. Just where we are, leaving education to one side, I think it's great sometimes when you force companies or organisations or countries to do something, you get legislation. As much as we'd all like to think we'd all be able to get around a table and agree amicably how we're dealing with it, legislation can be a good stick to force countries, organisations to actually deliver certain outputs. Going back on the education system, yeah, it's still going back to we've got to take it down to a level where we engage the public. Where we're talking about the legislation that we're talking about right now. These things are happening in the European Parliament around the world, and all the rest of these legislation things are happening. But you still need to try and get to a stage where science and everything it entails is engaging, where the youngsters of today start to look up to say, I want to be that scientist, I want to be that academic, lawyer, or whatever. They need to get at a level they understand, so they think it's engaging and a worthwhile career. And that's where I think they're still a step away from that, because they just don't want to know, or they don't, when we do speak to them, it's in a language they don't understand. It's not down at their level, so it's never going to engage them.
Thank you. We're going to take a short break here in Oban. Thank you very much to the panel here, and also to John Matthews. We'll be back on air at OOSKAnews.net in about 22 minutes' time. So good time to take a short break for a coffee. Maybe you could grab some breakfast, John, and we'll be back with you shortly. Thank you very much. Hello and welcome back to the inaugural OOSKAnews produced aquaNOW audience from the Scottish Association for Marine Science in Oban, Scotland. We return for the second half of our programme. Our hosts, represented here by marine scientist Dr. Paul Tett, are world leaders in marine science and also where it touches freshwater issues, where the river meets the sea, where human behaviour towards freshwater affects the marine environment and all of our futures. The second half of our presentation today takes a slightly different format. OOSKAnews has produced over the last 7 years about 35,000 water-related stories. Some of these touch the marine part of water thinking, most of them don't, but the OOSKAnews team have identified for our panel a small number of water-related stories that we have published in the last 2 weeks. So these are current water news stories, which do touch the world of marine ecosystems and oceans, and so are particularly worthy of our attention as a panel today, given our gracious hosts and their specialty. Those of you watching at home or in the office will see at the bottom of your screen at the moment, beneath the shot of the panel, a URL which, if clicked, will link to the first of, I hope we get to, 4 stories that have been circulated among this panel prior to the event that have been reported by OOSKAnews in the last 14 days and touch on marine and ocean systems. Click on that and you'll get directly to the story at ooskanews.com. The panel here have the stories in front of them, as does the audience in Oban. I'll give you a quick headline and first sentence on each of them, and then give Dr. Tett first an opportunity to present his perspective and some thoughts on the implications of each story, then ask our other panelists to chip in with their perspectives and views. The first story we draw to your attention is headlined, World Bank lends Brazil $18 million to increase coastal protection. This was filed by an OOSKAnews writer. It's datelined Washington, D.C., and 30th of September. The first sentence will give you the gist. The World Bank Board of Directors has approved an $18.2 million loan to support Brazil's Marine Protected Areas project. The project will triple the Brazilian coastal area under environmental protection from 5.5 million to more than 17.5 million hectares. There then follows some elaboration and government comment on the story. Paul, can I ask you for your thoughts on this particular recent news story?
Well, I'm not going to comment directly on the content of the story. What I would like to do is unpack a few of the terms here, particularly coastal protection. What does it mean, and why do we need to do it? The Brazilian Minister of the Environment is quoted as saying the coastal zone is currently one of the most environmentally threatened regions in Brazil. And of course, it's not only in Brazil. The coastal zone is one of the most environmentally threatened regions almost all over the world. And one of the reasons for this is that nearly half of humanity lives in what the United Nations defines as the coastal zone. We live there mostly because we like it, because transport is good there, because there are lots of resources there. And in truth, outside of Africa, humanity has favoured the coastal zones for the past 50,000 years. I sometimes think that our subspecies of humanity ought to be called Homo sapiens littoralis, with reference to our life in the coastal zone. And we know that because archaeologists have excavated shell middens from the west coast of Scotland, showing that the first people who came to Scotland after the ice retreated were living on the enormous resources of food available from the sea. The coastal sea is often much richer than the food supplies you can get from a wooded land. So people have always lived at the seaside or near the seaside, and this is where, over much of history, huge cities have grown up, and they've particularly grown up where rivers meet the sea. Well, and this has naturally given rise to a wide range of environmental problems. The sheer pressure of human beings, our built environment occupying more and more of the land, woodland being cut down for agriculture. We're encroaching on nature directly in that way. Well, that's a bad thing from the perspective of nature, but it's also a bad thing from the perspective of human beings, because what nature supplies us with in the coastal zone is a collection of things that ecological economists are now calling ecosystem services. And for example, these services include coastal protection. Some of the Brazilian coastline I know is mangrove forest. And one of the things that mangroves do is protect the coast against erosion from wind waves, from storm surges, and from the bigger waves that you might get in tsunamis. And we know in other parts of the world where these mangrove woodlands have been removed and turned into maybe holiday parks or turned into shrimp farms, that the coastline behind is much more vulnerable to the effects of hurricanes and to the effect of tsunamis. So the general principle here is there are very good self-centered reasons for humanity to protect these coastal regions. So it's very good news that Brazil is working harder to do that in what they, as they say, is one of the most impacted regions in Brazil, because that's where most Brazilians live, in the coastal zone. And indeed, I know that the degradation of ecosystems in the coastal zone in Brazil is much greater than that in the Brazilian rainforest itself. It's the rainforest that we hear about, but it's actually the various sorts of coastal vegetation which are much more at risk.
Thank you. I was thinking that this might be one for you to chip in on, John Matthews, with your ecologist background. Anything to add to what Paul Tett has said, and is $18 million doesn't seem like an awful lot to be protecting the coastal regions of Brazil.
That's true. It's a relatively small investment, probably in terms of kind of short time scales. The Brazilian government and maybe the private sector in Brazil see more opportunity costs in terms of maybe displaced fisheries and so on. But my understanding of the research around marine protected areas in general is that they serve as a reservoir for much larger parts of the ocean than is covered by their boundaries, and that ultimately this is an extremely important and critical kind of investment that we need to be able to make. These MPAs serve as a buffer. Echoing Paul's comments, the oceans are undergoing many kinds of transformation right now, and face very complex and very intensive pressures, and an MPA is a way to create a resilient and effective buffer. So kudos to the Brazilian government for pursuing this.
Okay. Panelists. Kevin.
Yeah, 18 million, not a lot. Quite significant amount of acreage to be protected, but one thing that got me was just a bit when they said there was an anti-deforestation pledge at the UN Climate Change Summit, and they were wanting Brazil to sign, and it's clear, although Brazil has got most of the rainforest in the world and it's a key ecosystem we've got to protect, someone didn't decide to speak to Brazil before they put it before them, which is surprising, because one thing, we were talking about transboundary issues earlier, one thing when you are wanting to try and formulate solutions, you've got to involve everybody it impacts on that particular solution. Once you get everybody in, organisations, countries, whatever, then they can eventually take ownership. They can see what the actual problems are, understand where people are coming from, but then you can start delivering the solutions to remove or make the problems have a lesser impact. So that's what certainly got me on this story.
But the forest issue has been around since Rio in '92. And it's mostly a north-south issue, where the north is saying, you know, we've deforested, and we need forests to help cleanse the air, to, you know, breathe in the carbon dioxide that we're spewing out, and then the forests breathe out oxygen that we breathe. And so the north is saying, okay, so south, you have the remaining forests, and so we want you to keep them pristine. And the south is, the global south is saying, but we need to deforest our country for acreage for farmland, for timber to sell on the global market. And so it's nice, it's all well and good for you in the north to say we should protect our forests, but why don't you pay us to protect our forests? And Ecuador tried that, and Ecuador said, all right, we will protect our forests, but we want you to pay us, global north, for protecting our forests. And they got, I think, just a few pennies. And so that's the real issue here. Brazil is in the global south, and they're saying, oh yeah, it's all well and good for you folks to sign on to. And I didn't see who all signed this declaration. But I bet you it's a lot of the countries in the global north as opposed to the countries in the global south.
Which that has to do with the underlying topic of legitimacy, right? Who has the legitimate saying to come and tell you what you should do with your resources? Why can you use them as others have used it on the past? And I think you mentioned the word ownership. What type of ownership do you have over a declaration or a state of good intentions over your resources in which you had no part in developing? So if you haven't been part of the process of developing a declaration or developing a plan or a program to deal with your natural resources, you cannot expect that you will implement it, or you cannot expect that you would gladly abide by it. So I think that the point of legitimacy is important, because if you are not part of the team that it's making the decisions, you cannot be just imposed a declaration on your own natural resources.
Isn't this a symptomatic thing across an awful lot of UN activity? A lot of talking and not. Little legitimacy and little enforcement. Richard, you work with international institutions. I'm aware of your work with the European Union, which does have a bit more teeth. What do you think of this story?
Well, I think Rennie said it quite correctly, that in the Northern Hemisphere there's a sort of recognition that we do need to manage our resources more effectively, and we're trying to persuade people that have quite a large proportion of remaining natural resources not to use those resources, and it is a very challenging thing. But certainly within the European context, there's definitely a push to actually promote resource efficiency, green growth and the circular economy, and start to actually actively think about the impact of using the resources, reclaiming the resources and recycling them to make better use of them. And I think that'll become more important going forward as a lot of the natural resources diminish. I mean, a good example from a European context is phosphorus, and it's very well understood that there's only a limited amount of phosphorus, and much of that phosphorus is being exported from the countries that have it into China and India and so on. So phosphorus prices go up, but phosphorus is still needed. And then there's the whole phosphorus balance within food production and the water systems, and phosphorus tends to then get discharged and impact on the ecosystems. So there needs to be thought about recapturing that phosphorus and put it back into good use, and that as I say, that's quite a significant issue at the moment.
So who's not doing the thinking? Is it the government's folks or the technology folks?
I think there's a great deal of thought going into this. I think again, from a European context, it's very much at the forefront of the political mindset, and it's very much at the forefront of research and development and science and engineering. So I do think there's a lot of thinking going in there, but these are difficult problems to solve, and so the solutions aren't terribly obvious. And I think more work will continue to try to identify ways of actually making us a lot more resource efficient in the future. But no, I would certainly say that there's a lot of people thinking about these things at the moment.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
And this is for Paul and John. There are lots of pressures on marine areas. There's pollution coming from the land, there's overfishing, there's the mangrove decimation that you just talked about. And for you two, what would be the ideal marine protective area? What would you protect most of all? All of that, and how far out should it go?
Oh, yeah. Shall I try and
Please.
answer that? Yes. The answer is I don't know, because I don't think there is a general answer. But to go beyond that, I'm not even sure if the idea of geographical marine protection is the right one to address the problem. But maybe what we should be doing is looking at specific solutions for specific problems. So if you take ensuring the supply of young fish, for example, so that you have an adult fish stock that can be exploited in a fishery. Quite a lot of those young fish live and feed in mangroves. So I don't know whether the fishermen know this or not, but they might have an interest in maintaining the mangroves. Mm-hmm. The people who live behind the mangroves have an interest in maintaining the mangroves. So there's a strong case for maintaining mangrove woodlands along the edge of the coast. But it would take an expert in mangroves to say they have to be maintained in a pristine condition, or maybe there are many ways you can improve the mangrove as a fish nursery, for example. Maybe it can be managed to make it better for its specific purposes of coastal defence and fish nursery. So I think what I'm saying here, and I'm recapitulating Eleanor Ostrom in her Nobel lecture. I don't think there are any global solutions, anything that can universally be applied to solve the problem. It's necessary to look at the local issues to see what are seen as the difficulties locally, as you said, to engage local stakeholders in the solution, and then come up with something based on the best available scientific evidence, which is likely to work in that instance. Mm-hmm. So it'll be one thing for coastal mangroves, it'll be something different for the rainforest in the Amazon basin. It might be a different thing again, say, for the macaire on the west coast of the Hebridean Islands of Scotland. So it's not a very good answer to your question.
But John, you were Renee thought you could chip on that. So the problems are local, but can general principles be applied?
I think in general, yes. One of the terms I've heard that I like a lot is a portfolio approach, which is trying to, life is not distributed evenly, and it's often quite patchy in where we see living organisms. And in the ocean, we often see particular areas that may have a kind of superabundance of biodiversity, that they serve as almost kind of biodiversity recharge zones, and those are often very important because if you like a coral reef, for instance, or as Paul was saying, a mangrove forest has a much larger kind of biodiversity footprint than might be suggested by its spatial area alone. The other kinds of issues that I've seen come up quite frequently have been looking at where there's a strong kind of livelihoods connection. So people who live fairly close to natural resources. This has come up, say, in Indonesia or in a region in the Western Pacific called the Coral Triangle, where you see people that they have a very direct, very visceral connection with their livelihood. So if there's a change in kind of exploitation of marine resources, it very much affects some of the most vulnerable groups within a society. And the last area may be in terms of trying to think about kind of where are there areas that we can see some benefit from protecting by giving them space. Maybe they have been damaged. Again, Paul mentioned, say, that there are some mangrove forests that have not been well taken care of. They've been harvested, or maybe there's some pollution issues. If we gave that area some space, could it in effect bounce back? and have a kind of multiplier effect with enough time and restoration efforts. So those are kind of three principles that I've seen used in many cases.
John, I think I'd like to move on to the second story and get through as many of these as possible. Again, those watching remotely, there will be appearing now a URL, and you can click to that to see the whole story. I'll give you the headline and the first sentence, and then ask Dr. Tett to comment. This is datelined Melbourne, Australia, 29th September. New climate change model predicts impacts on estuaries. A new climate change model is the world's first to predict impacts on estuaries about which little is known by looking at what is happening in similar ecosystems elsewhere in the world. The report was released by researchers at Deakin University, Melbourne, Australia, and it was on the occasion of, or in New York at the UN Climate Summit. Paul Tett.
Yeah, so I suppose this is a story that brings together several issues. One of them is obviously the impacts of climate change through rising sea level and through changing patterns of precipitation. So estuaries might receive more water or less water depending on what's going on inland. So the issue there is, how is this going to interact to determine what the estuary looks like, both physically in its shape and its beaches, and biologically in terms of the organisms that live there. So that's one set of issues. Another set of issues is, how do we predict the future? How do we get some idea of what might happen as a result of global change, and how do we do that cost effectively? So to pick up the first issue, what's happening to estuaries? Estuaries are highly dynamic. They're a balance between water, sediment content, and the forces in the sea outside. If humans don't interfere, estuaries come to some sort of equilibrium between sediment carried down in the river and the shape of the estuary. If it's a small estuary, there'll be sandbanks and channels. If it's a big estuary, then you might get a huge delta, like the Yangtze would be under natural conditions, or the mouth of the Amazon. Humans begin to interfere with that by canalising the river so that ships can get up it. Because we like to build cities around estuaries, then again we canalise it further, because we don't want the sandbanks on which we build our houses to shift. And there are, of course, beautiful examples of this, both in Venice and in St. Petersburg. Both of them built in estuaries by stabilising the sediment. But if you do that, the estuary ceases to be a dynamic place, and Venice is a very good example, because it's not sustainable. It's steadily settling into the water for various reasons, and enormous sums of money are now being spent on maintaining the Venice lagoon, and it's not clear to me that this is going to last more than a few more decades. So there's the issue of human interference with the dynamic process in estuaries. But the second issue for me is, how do we predict the future? An enormous amount of money, probably in billions, has been spent on climate change models, because that's clearly of great importance. And even the billions spent on modelling is a tiny fraction of the cost of climate change for us over the next century. But the climate change models, although they all predict global warming, they're very varied in how much global warming they predict, when and where. And part of the reason for running many models is to get some idea of this variability. Now, in all the other problems about the future, we're spending, and I know this is a researcher who's tried to do this, we're spending peanuts, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. So the modelers have to think of very cost-effective ways of making predictions. And as I understand this story, one way of doing that is a semi-empirical approach. So you look at what's happened in estuaries where there are lots of data, where there is lots of scientific studies, and then you find the nearest estuary to your type of estuary. So they've compared Eastern and Western Australia, and so from that they've made some deductions about what will happen in Western Australian estuaries in the future. So it's a good way of doing things if you don't have much time or money, but it runs into what the philosophers call the problem of induction. We have some empirical observations now. How do we know they're going to go on being reliable in the future? What we need, I think, are what I would call mechanistic models which mathematically describe the underlying processes and then use them to simulate forwards into the future. But building and validating such models are very expensive, and it's not clear to my mind, and I say this as a researcher, that it's not clear there's enough funds available actually to do that to the extent that we really need it to be done, so we can say what is going to happen. So this is not just a problem for Australian estuaries, it's a problem for the Thames estuary, for example, in Britain. It's a problem for many European estuaries.
Who would like to go next on that? Kevin.
I would say, well, this was an excellent example of using model. There's lots of models out there, as we just heard there, but an example of actually using real data. I see a lot of models come past me on various predictions, obviously on the wastewater, looking at catchments, and then when you dig underneath the surface, it's just based on basic assumptions they've made rather than spend the time and money to go out and get real information. So this, for me, is a good story that I actually used real data to predict what's going to happen somewhere. The thing some people don't miss out, the time spent on generating these models and putting, getting all the clever people with the IT to work it out, could be time better spent people in the field getting the data, then firing it into their model. Models are only as good as the information that goes in. Certainly when you see information coming on, this model predicts this, go behind that, start challenging where the information is, so then you can decide how confident you are that this model can actually predict anything in the real world, as opposed to just off the basic assumptions which don't bear any reality to anything.
Well, no, I don't wish to disagree with you about the need for real data, but it seems to me, isn't there a case that a model which is based on, say, sound physical principles, which have been developed by extensive study over hundreds of years and are well known to work. They enable us to send rockets to the moon or drive motor cars. Surely a model based on that sort of assumption, that set of assumptions about the behaviour of water and sediment is not going to be based on assumptions, or rather the assumptions have a considerable empirical content in themselves, that they reach back to a mass of data in the past.
On your side of the business, they seem to have a good chance of models doing what they're meant to predict. On my side of the world, where I live in the wastewater industry, all too often models are put forward as what's going to happen, and we invest the loads of money, and then we actually find out they weren't any good because of the information. So it would be good if on our side of the business, the engineers, the designers and all that took a hold of how you guys deliver it and learn something from that. Yeah. Because all too often we put a lot of investment into things, a lot of big civil structures, I think we were just chatting about earlier, and what we've actually got isn't delivering what we expected, and then we go back to actual fact the model was wrong, the very basic assumption what we've built on was wrong.
I mean, is this a case of the modelers having assumptions about what the model should predict, and then they're tweaking the model, they're turning the dials on the model until it predicts what we assume it will predict?
Well, you can always get whatever answer you want out of a model because you know how to tweak it. Yeah. What we need when anything comes forward and saying here's what the model is, we need the people that are doing the checking to make sure the actual initial information that went in to produce this was correct, and then you can make decisions off the back of it.
John Matthews in Oregon, you'd like to chip in on this one?
Yeah, I think that it's very easy to focus on maybe the newsworthy aspect of this as being the kind of technical knowledge. But if we step back, in my experience, especially around climate change issues, when you talk to the people that are involved in decision-making processes, whether they're a policymaker or they're someone trying to do planning or some other type of synthetic work, is that they often feel very, very frustrated with the science. Many of the sciences that are really relevant for climate change are not good predictive sciences, and that's a very serious challenge when we're making these kinds of long-term decisions. And the way that we in say the West, the way that we deal with that is we go back to the historic record and we say, well, what's the range of variability? What has happened to us before? Can we make an effective decision based on what we have experienced and maybe a little imagination and creativity? I think, to me, the real crisis of climate change is that not only do all of us as a species not have a future, but in most of the developing world, we don't have a past either. We don't actually have that record of what has happened, either in the kind of scientific and technical analysis or the kind of a recorded historic record. I think what I felt really was a positive message in this particular story was, in effect, it was using models as a way to help almost kind of pair different kinds of regions and systems by analogy with one another. In effect, so that different parts of the world that were more or less similar could borrow from those experiences, even though they may be divided very much by geography. And I think that's a very powerful way of helping many kinds of stakeholders, many kinds of decision makers make better and more sustainable decisions in the long run.
Thank you, John. I'm conscious of time, and with the permission of the panel and the audience, I'll move on to the third story, unless there's something very pressing you'd like to add to that one. Again, those who are watching us remotely, there is a URL at the bottom of your screen with a direct link to a story whose headline is "Vietnam Seeks New Rice Varieties to Weather Seawater Incursion and Floods." It was a story that was filed for OOSKAnews in the Philippines on the 26th of September. The first sentence: "Flooding in Vietnam's Mekong Delta is becoming more intense and difficult to control due to climate change, according to climate researchers." I'll give you the second sentence. The third sentence: "A new project, Climate Change Affecting Land Use in the Mekong Delta, led by researchers at the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, is developing new and improved rice seeds that are more resilient to flooding and saltwater intrusion." Paul Tett, again, please be first, and then perhaps I'll ask Richard Allen.
I was thinking I was going to pass the baton on
well,
this one.
let's be spontaneous. Richard, you're up.
Thank you very much.
Richard is reminding our audience is a senior fellow at the James Hutton Institute, which is a world-renowned centre for food research. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I mean, clearly crops and food research is my area of expertise. But what I can say is, the James Hutton Institute is a vested interest in this area, and they've done a lot of work on cereal crops, looking at varieties that can survive the extremes of climate change. So I think that this story here is quite relevant to a lot of what that's done at the James Hutton Institute. And it's certainly fair to say that here in Vietnam, similar with the James Hutton Institute, they are seeking different varieties and hybrids of rice in this case, but it could be barley or wheat in other parts of the world, that can actually weather out these extreme conditions, whether it's saline, whether it's drought, whether it's flooding and so on. And this comes back to the point that I made perhaps right at the beginning. There's a real issue in terms of looking at some of the holistic solutions for food, energy and water, and how they all interact and how they're all kind of related. So yeah, I think this area particularly is going to become more important going forward as we seek to secure food for a global population that's continuing to grow. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that Vietnam's not the largest producer of rice; it's the second largest producer of rice in the world. So if they have a crop failure, that's going to impact it not just in the region but kind of internationally. So it is a very, very pressing issue.
Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
I think something that's not told in this story is that Vietnam is at the end of the Mekong. And so I wonder, and as we know, the Mekong starts in Tibet, winds through China, Laos, and on down into Vietnam. And it's being dammed a lot now, which means that the flows in the Mekong are changing. And so I'm wondering if the seawater intrusion that they're experiencing now is a result of a diminished quantity of water coming down through the Mekong.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a significant contributing factor. Yeah, definitely. So I mean, the changes in requirement for the freshwater resource in terms of perhaps energy production through maybe a hydro dam or something has a huge impact on the sustainable agricultural systems that they've got there, and then they're having to then seek other ways of protecting the crop growth as a result of that. So again, it's a very good example of where you've got this food, water, energy nexus coming into play. This is one example of many, but.
Juan Carlos, you mentioned the Mekong specifically earlier as one of the key transnational rivers with tensions and disputes. What's your take on this story?
Well, I have to somehow echo what Alan has just said and what René stressed in the sense that it's good news that the international community and also water managers are starting to think in a more integrational way of thinking. It took us several years, at least in the governance and in the policy communities, to understand the interlinkages between water, energy, and food, and start talking about this so-called nexus, which is another new buzzword. But the important and the good news here is that we are not only thinking of water, but we are also thinking about uses of water, which is one of the things that you really see quite prominently in this piece of news, and that happily is having an impact on the way that we develop policies for water management. So this integrated thinking, I think it's very, very important. The other thing that I take on this article is the transboundary context, what René was just mentioning. And I think it really shows that as much as national efforts for adaptation are important in a context of a transboundary river like the Mekong, you have to coordinate among countries, because in a way your or Vietnam's adaptation strategies in this case might result less effective if what happens upstream is not taken into consideration. And you don't really have a say in what happens upstream unless you coordinate with your riparians. And just one last point on this article, because I found it very interesting. It's the amount of money that it's required for developing dikes on the whole part of the water course. It mentions here that they have invested $25.2 million in diking, but they will need $71.4 million to finish whatever engineering solutions they want to implement. And it just got me thinking of this idea of ecosystem-based adaptation, which I think that John can also talk to us a little bit more. But the whole point is not only to implement for adaptation purposes engineering and hard engineering solutions, but when possible, and this seems to be a case in which you could also restore ecosystems as a means of having a more cost-effective mechanism for adaptation. So I don't know, John, if you want to respond to possibilities of ecosystem-based adaptation in this context.
Sure. Thank you. I think to step back just a bit, there's really kind of two kinds of action that we associate with climate change. One is adaptation, and this story is largely about adaptation. That's how we adjust to emerging and realized climate change impacts. The second is climate change mitigation, how we think about the rate of increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So a lot of that discussion is about clean energy in particular. And in the case of Vietnam, I think is interesting because Vietnam may represent a sort of new generation of problems that we are beginning to face. As a downstream country, it is actually seeing a great deal of upstream development that's starting to occur in the lower Mekong countries with hydropower that is being developed in the name of clean energy. So there's a strong kind of climate change message, but really on this kind of greenhouse gas concentration approach. The Shayaburi Dam in Laos is maybe the most visceral example of that, and Vietnam was justifiably very concerned about that, because what is the Mekong? It's not just the element, the molecule H2O that's flowing in the river basin. It's also sediment. It's also the fisheries. It's all the things that actually make Vietnam a very fertile country. And if there's a significant amount of development that occurs, especially in the main stem of the Mekong, then it actually could have really important impacts on the adaptation trajectory. So we see Vietnam, in effect, being kind of squeezed between two different climate change issues, the mitigation and adaptation. In terms of the specific point that Juan Carlos was just raising about ecosystem-based adaptation, I think that's a very powerful kind of emerging approach. The UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, has been paying some special attention to that area. There's also been a lot of kind of localized development, including by the Vietnamese government and Vietnamese NGOs around that. And the idea is effectively, can we begin to think of ecosystems as becoming part of our infrastructure network? Can we, Vietnam, not only is it one of the largest rice producers in the world, it's also one of the largest mangrove forest countries in the world. And that those mangrove forests, they help anchor the soil and the coastline. They protect cities. They serve as a powerful repository, and they also capture that soil that comes downstream. And that's a really important reason for thinking. Maybe we should make sure that those mangrove forests play a really significant role. If we lose them, then we have to start thinking about either coastal retreat of our built landscape, or building really high walls against the ocean. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Paul Tett. Indeed, I draw your attention to a couple of sentences towards the end of this article where one of the local experts blames the loss of coastal protective forests, the mangrove forest that we've been talking about, as the main cause of erosion of sea dikes. And it does begin to seem to me, I'm not clear that this is a problem of sea level rise. There hasn't been much sea level rise so far. I see it much more in the terms that the rest of the panel have spoken about as the result of upstream changes, differences in the flow in the Mekong, and secondly, changes in land use within Vietnam, which are stopping the Mekong functioning as a dynamic system. So I would guess that it's its surface is lowering in relation to the sea, because it's no longer dynamically maintaining itself because of lack of sediment input from the river, and because there are not so many mangroves there to capture and trap the sediments. And to be a bit more provocative, it's slightly perverse to try and make rice salt tolerant when mangroves are already salt tolerant and it's a different ecosystem service, I admit, but already have those genes built in to allow them to adapt to salt water. And I think there's a point for the media here, David, which is we often don't get the context of stories like this. Mm-hmm. We often see them as a simple linear response. Okay, here's an environmental problem, sea level rise. Here are our biological engineers, in this case, redesigning rice to cope with this. When I think, as we've said, there's a much wider context, and it's well worth looking at that context. Well, that's what we've been doing, isn't it? So pat ourselves on the back for doing that.
I'll just say threats and opportunities. And like here we have it, we've got issues with the salinity of the soil affecting the rice production, and they're going in to look at other types of variations of their rice to overcome this problem. But the great thing about when you start doing some kind of research, you go on thinking on one line of thought, thinking you're going to solve a problem, but you learn something else along the way. But that something else along the way is they might not necessarily at the first try work out how to grow a salt tolerant type of rice, but that actual grain could solve a problem elsewhere in the world for other rice growers. So there's opportunity. They could develop another strain of rice which could overcome some other issues in another part of the world and use that as a benefit to grow their economy, bringing some much needed income coming in. So again, there's a lot of threats out there, but at the same time it drives opportunities to be exploited.
But I would certainly add to Paul's bit in terms of I really like this comment about the fact we need to think about things more holistically in the wider ecosystem services context, and he's quite right to point out that they're looking at this problem from one angle. In actual fact, it's like a multi-angle problem, and they need to consider all of these options, and they need to think about the reasons behind why the saline water is actually migrating into the area, rather than just trying to solve the problem about rice growing. And only through taking a holistic view of the ecosystem and the ecosystem services will they actually get to solve it more sustainably, I think.
Just on one last note on this why, I have the impression that Vietnam is quite astute and quite smart in understanding the why, and this is why they have actually ratified this year the UN Watercourses Convention, right? Thinking of good news, and also in the spirit of this seminar, competition for water resources, I think it's very important, if we are talking about Vietnam, to mention that this year the UN Watercourses Convention has entered into force as a consequence of the ratification of Vietnam, particularly thinking of what are the causes of this type of problems.
For those of our audience who aren't as familiar with the convention, the River Courses Convention, perhaps you could speak to its importance in geopolitics and the significance of Vietnam signing, and who signed and who hasn't, and what difference does it make?
Who has signed and who hasn't. So basically we have 35 countries that have ratified the convention. Vietnam is the only country outside Europe and West and Central Africa that has ratified. So it's very interesting because it's becoming in a way a water champion, if you will. What's the importance of having such a convention? It's the first time in the history of water cooperation and water resource management that the principles of equity and the principles of not causing a significant harm to your neighbor are becoming treaty law. So even though they were principles as aspirational principles in the past, now they are becoming hard treaty law for all the countries that are ratifying the convention. So why is it important? It's an instrument that countries can use to put political pressure on other countries. This is a little bit what I think Vietnam is doing vis-a-vis Laos, for instance, or vis-a-vis Thailand, but also in the case that Laos and Vietnam and Thailand and Cambodia would be part of this agreement, then they have the obligation of informing and negotiating any type of developments that might have environmental impacts with all the other riparians. So it's a very powerful tool of negotiation that puts very clear rules of the game of how you have to go about using the waters that you share with your neighbors.
Thank you. Let's move on to the fourth of the OOSKAnews stories that we'd like our panel to engage with this afternoon. Those of you watching remotely, the URL is at the bottom of your screen for the entirety of the story content. The headline, well, I suppose this is a different aspect of the water energy nexus. Tons of radioactive water still entering Pacific Ocean from Fukushima nuclear plant. Filed for OOSKAnews in Tokyo on the 25th of September. Japan's Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, devastated by earthquake and tsunami that hit the country in March 2011, is still releasing tons of radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean, despite recent progress by plant operator TEPCO in containing the problem. The story goes on to also describe the problems with groundwater contamination from the disaster. Paul, would you like to go first on this, please?
So I think I can draw on some oceanographic expertise here, but I think I'd just start off by saying that this would be a source of, I think, great trauma for the local population if it had occurred in Britain, for Japanese people who have been the targets of the only nuclear bombs dropped intentionally on human beings. It must be an even greater source of angst. So I think there's a lot of feeling here, which is in addition to what we can say about the natural science. So having said that, for me the natural science would seem fairly straightforward. We've got a problem of, I think of as integrated coastal zone management. There's groundwater and radiation treatment water seeping from storage tanks and getting into the sea, and then the sea is carrying it off somewhere. It would be a straightforward matter to make observations of currents and to use numerical physical models to predict where that water will go in the sea under a range of weather conditions, and to work out how much the radioactivity will be diluted. So it's not a difficult task to make a precise prediction of what will happen to the radioactivity and how far will it have to be diluted before it falls below acceptable thresholds. And that's the sort of thing that the physical oceanographers in SAMS do all the time for we don't have radioactive discharges, I hasten to say, but we're interested in working out what the effect of various sorts of discharges would be on the water outside us in the Firth of Lorne. For example, suppose there's an invasive species starts releasing larvae into the water here. How far will that be carried? And if the larvae land on the basis of offshore wind farms, will that give them a stepping stone to somewhere else? So we make models for that sort of thing. So the science is quite well known. But then I return to the social side of this, and again, always find the most interesting things towards the end of the story. So TEPCO has said that it hopes to treat the water in the storage tanks and then release it into the ocean. In order to do this, the company had to receive approval from local fishing communities who are afraid the contaminated water will wreak havoc on their livelihoods. And of course it can wreak havoc in two ways. It can increase radioactivity in their fish, or it can simply make the public think we don't want to buy these fish, even if they're completely safe to eat. So what seems to be a simple issue from a physical point of view turns out to be quite a very complicated one, I think, when you start looking into the social and economic context.
Kevin Jeffrey, and then John Matthews.
Couple of points. One, reiterating issues with model. I think one of the problems we had with this particular plan was going back to initial modelling of how they designed this. They could work out what size of tsunami would be generated by the size of earthquake, and what did they do? They engineered the actual wall to keep back that tsunami to be at about there or above that height of wave. What they didn't think when they put into the model was what will happen to the plates. Subsequently, they went down by about 1 metre, and that's what caused the inundation with the water, and hence they're now trying to work on solutions to try and combat their problems. But again, touching back on the previous point, is when you're engineering anything or looking at something, if you are working on models, it's only as good as the information you put in. They thought they had sussed out the size of tsunami would generate a 10 metre high wave or whatever. They built structures accordingly, but they forgot about, hey, what happens to the plate? And what happened to the plate here? It moved by 1 metre and they were inundated.
John.
This is you know, I know that the article is intended to provide a kind of hopeful spin that there's a lot less contaminated groundwater that is going to be leaking out from this reactor. But one of my first thoughts was this also sounds like the start of the next really bad Godzilla film. It's very, I think, you know, the larger issue is really concerning for exactly the issues I think that Kevin has just raised. You know, the engineering and the kind of policy decisions that went into creating this plant were not really thinking in a larger picture. We talk in the water community very often about the water footprint of many different kinds of activities, say in agriculture or in energy. And in energy, we tend to focus on things like hydropower. How many liters go to generate a kilowatt of hydropower? Maybe we need to also be thinking about how many tons of water are going to go to try to address this as a long-term ecological issue. So what is the water footprint of this now defunct nuclear plant?
Not much good news in that story. Would anybody else like to contribute? We have a few minutes left before we wind up, and with the panel's permission, we'll return to an element of today's aquaNOW audience which we didn't have time for in part one. And we don't have much time for it now, but the broad question that the aquaNOW audiences would like to put to you and hear differing views from. Earlier we asked, what keeps you awake at night? The follow-up question is, what's the biggest misunderstanding about the complex subject of water from your perspective? We've heard many voices today saying it's a complex subject, we need more education, the media needs to examine questions holistically, and speaking as a publisher of water news, I'm very critical of the mainstream media for its somewhat naive take on water stories when they sometimes raise their heads above the parapet. So the question is, what is the biggest misunderstanding about water issues in your view? Renee, can you go first, please?
In my mind, the biggest misunderstanding, and I assume you mean in the general public,
Yes.
yes, is how deeply embedded water is in everything. I mean, people, like, I have a glass of water right here, and I was able to get it from that pitcher, which filled it from a tap somewhere. And so as long as people can open the tap and get water, then they think that's all the water that they need. And they don't think about the fact that, water went into manufacture my reading glasses here, and went into manufacturing this paper, and probably went into this energy. And so it's embedded everywhere. And when we talk about a global water crisis, it's not just drinking water. Domestic water is only 10% of the use on average globally. 70% of the use of water is in food. And I'm not sure the people are aware of what they call the virtual water trade, and that is water that's embedded in the food that is grown someplace else and then exported from there and imported into another country and gets on my plate.
Richard Allen.
That's exactly the same answer I would have given, to be honest.
Juan Carlos.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, water pervades every aspect of what we do, activities. It supports life. It's needed for all the kind of manufacturing efforts that we have. Every activity touches on water in some shape or form. And I think Rennie's absolutely right to say that people don't necessarily recognise the embedded nature of water and the things that we consume on a day-to-day basis. Very few people think about it, and I think that really is a big issue. Yeah.
Juan Carlos.
So I understood also the question in terms of why is water not out there. If we as water people or in the water community, we read about the potential water crisis, we are aware of future stressors that are going to deepen that water crisis. We are also aware that in several regions of the world that crisis is going to be very, very, very deep. So why is it not out there? And I have the impression that we are lacking champions. We are lacking leadership, both in terms of individuals that actually can carry the voice and go out there and be representatives of this movement, if you want, but also state leaders. I think that in the global concert, it is also needed initiatives, for instance, like the one of the Scottish government, and saying I'm going to step up and I'm going to be a hydro nation and I'm going to at least try to lead a dialogue on water issues for them to become a little bit more prominent and be more discussed, and so that eventually they can come out of this water safety box and get out there where they have to be heard.
Kevin Jeffrey.
Yeah, the thing I always hear is, why does it cost so much, or what's the issue here? It's free, it falls from the sky. And again, that's a lack of understanding what goes behind getting that little glass of water. And that, well, particularly it's an issue in the UK, maybe less so in other parts of the world when you can see it's a major resource. But again, hopefully through the hydro nations, Scotland has grasped this one by the nettle to join up academics, to join up companies, to join up the utilities, manage that resource, and then see that resource as someone you could also solve problems elsewhere in the world.
I think that's right. I mean, I think it's relatively easy to calculate out the cost of water treatment, but it's less easy to actually put a value on water. I think that's what we're saying. People don't actually understand the true value of water, and that needs to be better understood.
Yeah.
John Matthews.
I think many people view water almost with a kind of conspiracy theory mentality, that they think that most of the major decisions that are made around water are made by people who are self-described water specialists, such as us, and that these mostly technical specialists may not have a very holistic view, and there, I think, historically and in many parts of the world today, that's true. There's more than a little truth in it, but I maybe echoing Renee, I would like for all of us to really think of ourselves as water managers, and that the decisions that we are making on a daily basis actually have very long-term implications, and especially given recent weather and climatic events, given recent economic events over the past decade, we should be very humble about the future, and we should think very carefully about the kind of governance mechanisms, the way in which we negotiate and try to renegotiate the real and embedded water that runs through our economies and our ecosystems is extremely critical, so that we can prepare for the things that are deeply uncertain. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Paul Tett.
Yeah, so I'll go along with everything that my colleagues have said and then add my two pennyworth. And I guess my bit of the argument is counterintuitive. It's that dikes are not the best way of stopping floods. Whenever there's a flood, there's usually a public clamour to build up the banks of rivers or to build up sea defences. And we know in the long run this doesn't work. If you build up the banks of rivers, the water is simply carried more quickly downstream and it floods somebody else. So the counterintuitive way to prevent floods is to widen the river and let it flood parts of what people used to call floodplains. Similarly with sea defences, as long as they endure, they'll stand up against the sea. But a couple of months ago I was walking along the coastal path north of Blackpool along the Fylde coastline, and there the seawall's been torn to pieces by the storms in the winter. What's a better approach to coastal protection in many places is soft engineering of the landscape, is taking down the hard sea walls and letting salt marshes develop in our climate, or mangroves develop in tropical climates, because these natural communities absorb wave energy much more efficiently than do hard sea walls. Now, I admit there are places where you have to build up the river banks, and there are places where you have to build sea walls around, because we've got cities there and we don't want them flooded. But in many places it would be much better to go for this soft engineering approach. But it's very hard to convince most people this is true, because it seems counterintuitive.
Thank you, Paul. That brings us to the end of this afternoon's occasion, the inaugural aquaNOW audience. I would like to take the opportunity to thank all of our panelists who have engaged here, and John remotely, to thank the audience here, to thank the OOSKAnews team, to thank our sponsors, who are Highlands and Islands Enterprise, the Scottish Government and Scottish Enterprise, for making this occasion possible, and indeed 5 subsequent aquaNOW audiences, the next of which will be sited in Edinburgh at the same time on the 11th of November, and we look forward to having you as participants and viewers then. And finally, to thank Dr. Tett and everybody at SAMS very much for your kind hospitality today. It's a great facility and a lovely day to see it. Thank you very much for having us, and thank you for watching at home. Bye-bye.